Alright, here's blue-green Infect. This deck is no stranger to Modern. It has been becoming more and more popular for the last couple of years, and recently it just took down an Open in Orlando in the hands of Bradley Carpenter, and this is his exact 75 that I'm playing. Um, I've been following the Infect deck for a while now, but even though it's a known quantity, it's a deck I've played against a ton. It's also an important deck to play from both the playing against it and playing with it. So pretty happy to get a chance to play with it here and also go over some of the more interesting choices in this list. So 20 lands. The 4 Inkmoth Nexus, of course, 4 Inkmoth, a variety of fetches here. It doesn't really matter which ones you play as long as they can get a forest. So any of the green fetches could be a Misty Rainforest here. There's Catacombs, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills. And there's a couple of basics, 2 forests, and then not 1 but 2 Pendle Havens. And playing 2 Pendle Havens is actually pretty standard now. Sometimes you will draw 2, and that sucks, but they are just so important to the deck. It's basically a built-in pump spell in a land. So just being able to play it, play a Glistener Elf or a Noble Hierarch, then later you can make any of your Infect threats bigger because they're all 1/1s. So that extra point of power and 2 points of toughness is quite relevant. The 2 breeding pools, and then 1 Dryad Arbor. So Dryad Arbor you can fetch for with the fetch lands. Sometimes you want to board this card out, or it's not as good as another land would be. But other times it's a win condition. It's protection against a card like Liliana of the Veil. So it can be a surprise, and there's only so many creatures in the deck, and this is basically your 13th creature because you're not playing that many actual creatures. Sometimes you have to keep hands without a real creature in your hand. And there's also 4 Nexus, so sometimes you'll keep Nexus hand as well. So let's go on to the 1 mana cards, and there's a bunch of them. Gitaxian Probe is kind of a 0 mana card, but it helps allow you to know if the coast is clear in order to go for the win and just draw you into your most important cards. It's pretty low cost to play, and it's a pretty high ceiling on the card. Distortion Strike is a good card against decks that have a lot of creatures to block, especially flyers, because some of your best Infect threats are flyers like Inkmoth Nexus. You really want to be able to get that card through, and then Glistener Elf basically has no evasion, so being able to get your non-evasive threats through is important. Now, of course, with Blighted Agent, the unblockability is not that relevant, but it's a one-of. The rebound is also nice, so sometimes you're not going for the instant kill, but when it comes back, you once again give something unblockability, and that can be good enough. There's 1 Spell Pierce in the main, a couple more sideboard, just a versatile counter spell. There's so many different non-creature spells in the format, and your opponent is going to be trying to interact with your creatures with removal. So Spell Pierce is a way to help disrupt that. So there's also 2 Twisted Image in the main. So Twisted Image, when this deck first started seeing play, Twisted Image was not in the 75. Now it is seen play. It's been seeing play in the sideboard. Here we're actually seeing it main deck. It's a way to outright get rid of your opponent's mana creatures, like a Noble Hierarch. And it also deals with Spellskite, one of the most annoying threats for this deck. And it just cantrips. So worst case scenario, you play it, you draw a card, you move on with the game. For Mutagenic Growth, so Mutagenic Growth is a 0 mana pump spell. It's the amount of pump it provides, being only +2/+2, isn't as high as your other pump spells, but it also costs 0 mana. It helps get cards in the graveyard for Become Immense. Sometimes it does mean you have to use 2 of them in order to protect a creature from Lightning Bolt, but even then it can be worth it. So Mutagenic Growth, in my eyes, may very well be the weakest of the pump spells, but it's still in the deck. This deck needs a critical mass of pump effects. There are 4 Glistener Elves. One of the staple Infect threats. You need all of your Infect threats desperately. If one of these Infect cards wasn't in the format, there just wouldn't be enough Infect creatures to get the job done. 1 copy of Groundswell. So Groundswell is nice with your fetch lands and just playing a land. It becomes +4/+4 rather than +2/+2. Might of Old Krosa is similar to Groundswell in that it can be +2/+2 or +4/+4. But you're going to have more control over which one of those you want it to be. Most of the time you are just going to play it during your main phase and it's going to be +4/+4. Noble Hierarch is the non-Infect creature in the deck, but the Exalted is very relevant to be able to give your Infect creatures another bump in terms of power and toughness. It also produces both of the colors of this deck, and it's a 1 mana play that allows you to have super explosive draws. Vines of Vastwood is perhaps the most important of the pump spells in the deck, just because it can protect your creature from all sorts of spot removal spells, and there's always going to be weird situations that arise with this card where Vines of Vastwood is exactly what you need to get yourself out of a jam. And it also provides +4/+4, and that's a lot. It's a lot of a boost. Normally, 2 Vines of Vastwood plus another +4/+4 is going to end up being enough to get the job done. So we've got Blighted Agent. This could be the best of the Infect threats, even though it's 2 mana because of the unblockability. But yeah, I mean, just a great card. It's your best Infect threat in a lot of matchups, especially those that don't have a lot of removal and have a lot of creatures. There are 2 Apostles' Blessings, similar to Vines of Vastwood. It's primarily a way to protect your creatures, but the card can also be used as a way to get through opposing blockers by, say, giving your creature protection from whatever your opponent has on defense to block your Infect threat. There's 1 Dismember in the main, 2 more on the board. The reason why there aren't more is because the primary game plan of this deck is to kill your opponent as fast as possible. Dismember doesn't actively help with that, and it's a reactive spell, and normally the Infect deck it's one of the faster decks in the format, but you do need to draw the correct combinations of creatures, pump spells, and sometimes ways to protect your creatures. Dismember doesn't fall into that category. It is still, however, a good card, and it's here as a one of, and then you can board it in as you see more creatures out of your opponent's deck. And then one of the newer additions to the deck, Become Immense. This deck fills up its graveyard pretty easily with fetch lands, with pump spells, with Jataxian Probe. So this is pretty easily a 1 mana +6/+6 by turn 4. So yeah, I mean, it's the most bang for your buck in terms of a pump spell in the deck, and that's why there are 4 of them. Even though you don't really want to draw multiples, the card is just so powerful. There are still 4 copies in the main deck. So yeah, this is the configuration for the main. The sideboard has a lot of more reactive stuff. So Kitchen Finks is here against, obviously, the burn decks, the aggressive decks. We want to be boarding this card in. It's also just another grindy threat for against decks that have a lot of removal. Sometimes you do have to go on the direct damage play. The Viridian Corruptor is a card that comes in against your artifact decks. Some versions actually play it in the main, but here it's just a one-of in the sideboard. There's 2 Wild Defiance, which is great against the decks that have a lot of removal, especially like Lightning Helix, Lightning Bolt type cards, but it's also good because you can use your own pump spells with it to make them even bigger pump spells, essentially. There is the downside of it being a 3-mana card, but it is very powerful. More Dismembers. There's 2 copies of Nature's Claim. Enchantments and artifacts are pretty important in this format, so this card is just a very versatile sideboard option. Another Twisted Image against those mana creature type of decks. Spell Pierce, and then another Distortion Strike, and another Dispel. So we see basically just more of cards that are already in the main deck in the sideboard. Because certain of the 1 or 2 ofs in the main deck, we can swap out and then board in the ones that are better for a specific matchup. So the sideboard is pretty straightforward. There's a couple of cards that stand out, like the Finks, the Wild Defiance, and then there's other cards that are kind of just swapping here or there for some copies that are already in the main deck. So this is the Infect deck, and I'm excited to play with it.